welcome to Vices and Volumes. I'm your host, Avril Clinton-Ford, and in this episode we're going to talk about a college in Kildare, a very upset barrister, a queen with opinions, and the single most expensive piece of wishful thinking in 19th century British political history. We're going to talk about Maynooth College in County Kildare, Ireland. Or precisely about the extraordinary convulsions that gripped Westminster when somebody suggested that the government might modestly increase the funding it was already providing to a Catholic seminary that the government itself had founded, in a country that was almost entirely Catholic and had been for roughly 1,500 years. Before I begin, if you love the podcast and you'd like to help support me, I have a Ko-fi account which allows you to donate the price of a coffee to me. This supports the software, the equipment and the books that I use, and it allows me to continue the podcast for as long as possible without the need for advertising. I'll add the link into the show notes, but it's also in my socials, which are at Vices and Volumes everywhere. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube and Threads. Please follow me for any updates, news and interesting content, and let me know what you think of the podcast and join the conversation. So the book at the centre of this episode I bought a few weeks ago. It's Maynooth is mentioned in many of the books that I have, and this one caught my eye because it was specifically about the digest of the Maynooth Report, which I knew would be very interesting. It is a very politically charged book, and as its cover suggests, the content is equally boring. So it was a bit of a challenge to read, but it turned out to be very, very interesting indeed and gave me some perspective on some of the interesting Catholic and Protestant controversies that have surrounded Ireland for so long. Maynooth is one of my very local towns. It houses a modern university, Carton House. It's got excellent restaurants, pubs and cafes, and my favourite bookshop, Maynooth Bookshop. And among many other things, I spend quite a bit of time in Maynooth. It has over 850 years of incredibly rich and interesting history. It even has a castle. And recently I was attending Maynooth Through the Ages, which is a series of talks hosted by Maynooth University, where the fantastic professor, Terence Dooley, commented that Maynooth may be one of the most historically rich towns in Ireland, which I'm not likely to disagree with. I have a great affection for Maynooth in general, and like Dooley said, it is rich in history. It's got canal, railway, castle, big house. It's got some beautiful little buildings, a gorgeous main street, and many little curious points of history within it. I don't live in Maynooth, but I do consider it my place, my town. So here we are looking at this great town, and as you can imagine, I could find thousands of ways to discuss Maynooth and its history, but I have to have the book that references that, so I need to make sure that what I have works with what I'm talking about. So this particular book, to be fair, was a very hard read. It was a bit of an impulse buy, and frankly, it is a little bit boring to wade through. So it became more of a flick and view episode than it was an actual in-depth reading one. But it was published in 1855 by the Protestant Association Office in London, and it's called The Digest of Maynooth Commission's Report, with reference to such portions of the evidence as to relate to the antisocial, immoral and anti-national tendency of the teaching at Maynooth. It was written by James Lord of the Inner Temple Barrister at Law. This was all about Maynooth College, a seminary in County Kildare, Ireland. To set the tone, I will give you Mr. Lord's introductory remarks, where he outlines why the grant to Maynooth must be, in his view, withdrawn. With the light of the Holy Scripture before us, we are guilty of a national sin in endowing the anti-scriptural system of popery. That doing so is calculated to bring down divine judgments upon the nation, and that, consequently, the grant must be withdrawn if we would, as a nation, avoid the curse and enjoy the favour and blessing of Almighty God. Divine judgments, curses and the favour and blessing of Almighty God, contingent on whether Maynooth Seminary gets its building repaired or not. To understand why this book exists, why a London barrister felt very compelled in 1885 to produce what amounts to 296-page case for the prosecution against the college in Kildare in Ireland, we need to go back a further 60 years to 1795, when the British government did something that seemed, well, I suppose, perfectly sensible at the time. It built and funded a Catholic seminary on Irish soil where they did not want Catholicism to survive. St. Patrick's College in Maynooth was established by the Maynooth College Act in 1795. Ireland's Catholic clergy had traditionally been trained in Europe, mainly France, at colleges in Paris, Louvain and elsewhere on the continent. In 1795, that meant that they were being educated in a country where the guillotine had been busy for 2 years and revolutionary politics were in the water supply. The British government solution was, and this really is the founding irony of the entire century of argument that followed, it was to build Irish priests their own seminary at home in Ireland, funded by the British government. The thinking at the time is, semi-logical. It was that a priest educated in Kildare would be domestically attached, politically moderate, and broadly loyal to the crown because they were footing the bill. The theory of don't bite the hand that feeds you. However, this did not happen. But it took 50 years of not happening before anyone wrote a substantial, boring report on it. St Patrick's College had been training Catholic priests on a modest annual government grant since 1795. It had started around about £9,250 per year, which is the equivalent of a roughly 1.46 million today. It's not nothing, but it wasn't enormous either. And by 1843, the political temperature in Ireland had changed substantially, and one man was largely responsible, Daniel O'Connell. For listeners who are coming to this period fresh, a brief account of what O'Connell was doing in 1843 is important. So, a very quick and very basic summary. Daniel O'Connell, known in Ireland as the Liberator, was the dominant Irish political figure of the 19th century. He was born in County Kerry, 1775, and had already achieved one remarkable feat, Catholic emancipation in 1829, which finally allowed Catholics to sit in the Westminster Parliament after centuries of exclusion. Having won that, he turned his attention to the Act of Union 1800, which had dissolved the Irish Parliament and bound Ireland directly to Westminster. He wanted to repeal it, and he wanted an Irish Parliament restored in Dublin. By 1843, this repeal association had organised mass meetings at a scale that had never been seen before. And the historian R.F. Foster in Modern Ireland 1600 to 1972 records in one meeting at Tara, County Meath, drawing estimated 100,000 people. The British government under Prime Minister Peel watched this with understandable anxiety, the spectre of serious constitutional upheaval, or worse, organised physical resistance. It was very much on Westminster's mind, and this was a valid fear because Ireland had never accepted or settled as part of the empire. So Peel's response to the problem was, in his own way, suppose rational. The Catholic clergy were the most influential voices in Irish communities, so if you could keep the clergy educated, reasonably comfortable and, crucially, not dependent on continental seminaries where foreign ideas circulated freely, you might reduce the Church's appetite for political agitation. He felt they would not bite the hand that feeds them, and in 1845 he proposed to increase the Maynooth grant substantially. So it went from £9,250 to £26,360 per year. That is the equivalent today of jumping from 1.46 million to approximately 4.16 million annually, plus a one-off grant of £30,000 for building repairs, which is worth roughly 4.73 million in current terms. So there was a very large sum at play. The college was in poor physical condition, and the increase was significant to say the least. And Peel pressed it through, knowing it would cost him enormously with his own party. And then there was also Gladstone, because Gladstone's behaviour during the Maynooth vote is one of the more entertaining political sequences of the Victorian age, and it does deserve a little bit of attention. William Everett Gladstone at this point in his career was the president of the Board of Trade in Peel's government. In 1838, he had published a book called The State in its Relations with the Church, in which it argued at considerable length that a Protestant state had an obligation to support only Protestant institutions. This was his stated, published, sincere position. When Peel proposed the Maynooth increase in 1845, Gladstone recognised immediately that it contradicted the argument he had made in print. He could not, in good conscience, remain a cabinet pursuing a policy he publicly argued against. So, naturally, he resigned. But then he voted for the bill in the House of Commons. He resigned from cabinet, walked back into Parliament and voted in favour of the measure he'd just resigned over. His reasoning, as recorded in his diaries and discussed by his biographer Roy Jenkinson in Gladstone, published by Macmillan in 1995, was that he privately believed in the Maynooth increase was right and necessary, even though it contradicted his earlier published position. To vote against it would to allow his own past writings to override his present judgment of what was correct. Jenkins writes that Gladstone's resignation was regarded by his contemporaries as almost universally eccentric, if not bizarre. Even Peel apparently required a second explanation. The moral is perhaps that it is unwise to publish your principles before you have had to test them against an actual situation. Or as I often say, strong opinions held loosely. For the modern listeners, the sheer intensity of the Protestant reaction to Maynooth can look from a distance like simple bigotry. Some of it was, but if we're going to do it justice to the story, we need to understand why so many people felt so strongly about a seminary in County Kildare. Because the roots of it go deeper than just straightforward dislike, and they explain a great deal about why this argument ran for 60 years. Most of us in Ireland are well acquainted with the idea of us and them. When it comes to history between Ireland and Britain, there is a tension between the Catholic and Protestant, between the colonised and coloniser. But there is a layer underneath the nationality tension. And this was the theological and constitutional conflict. It's not just a cultural one. To understand why, you need to know what the Reformation had done to the legal structure of Britain. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in the 1530s, it was not simply a religious decision, it was a political one. The Church of England became a state institution with the monarch at its head. The coronation oath required the sovereign to uphold the Protestant Reformed religion as established by law. The Act of Settlement of 1701 was designed to ensure a Protestant succession permanently. The established churches of England and Scotland were part of the architecture of the state itself. Catholicism in its framework carried with it an inherent question. Where does your ultimate loyalty lie? With the crown or in Rome? From this perspective of Protestant Britain, the Pope was not simply a religious leader, he was a foreign head of state with his own territory, his own court, his own political relationships with the monarchies of Europe, and his own claims to authority over the souls and potentially the political behaviour of Catholics everywhere. For a British Protestant in 1845, a Catholic owned ultimate allegiance to a foreign sovereign in Rome. Whether that was fair or accurate is one question, but it was with the lens through which every element of the Maynooth debate was constructed. The most extraordinary section of John Lord's Chapter 1 is his own commentary. It is the raw evidence he quotes verbatim from the Commission hearing themselves, the testimony of Reverend J. O'Hanlon, a Maynooth professor. Lord is quoting him at length precisely because the professor's own words, in Lord's view, do the work better than any editorial comment could. Here is a sustained exchange from pages 7 and 8 of the digest, which Lord quotes under the heading Priest Recommending Candidate from the Altar. The Commissioner is questioning Reverend O'Hanlon. As to teaching them their duties, there are two modes in which may be done abstractedly and with reference to a particular man. I may say, vote for the man you think the best candidate, or I may say, vote for A or B because I tell you he's the best. Can the latter be properly done from the altar? I should make a distinction there. If the congregation be composed of persons as intelligent and as capable as himself of pronouncing on the relative fitness of the candidates, I should say that he ought not to refer to a particular man, but simply announce it to be their duty to vote for the party that they conscientiously believe to be decidedly the best candidate. But if his congregation consists of simple, uneducated, ignorant people who are totally incompetent and decide on the merits of the qualifications of the candidates, I maintain that the priest is warned to call upon them to vote for a particular person, provided the person's superior fitness is clear, decided, and unquestioned by the intelligent and enlightened portion of the community. It is the unalienable right of the strict duty of the priest to remove the ignorance of his people, particularly in the reference to those duties upon the performance of which the public good depends. It is his business to place them in a position which they shall be able to discharge those duties properly. You can see why John Lord includes this at length. He's not editorialising, he is simply letting the professor explain in his own words the conditions under which a priest is not only permitted, but bound to direct his congregation's votes from the altar. That Lord found this alarming is clear. That Lord was going to hear from the Crown Commission's report. Whatever confirmed his existing position is equally clear. But the question 157 exchange sits in the record exactly as he presents it. James Lord understood this lens very well. His introductory remarks before he has even reached Chapter 1, he sets out his central concern in the language that has a kind of breathless urgency to it. He is on page 3 in a passage he chooses to print in capital letters, which tells you something about how he felt about it. One chief point is to know what popery taught at Maynooth particularly does in Ireland and is doing elsewhere. He is not at this point talking about theology in the abstract, he is talking about elections. His immediate concern, spelled out in the same sentence, is that Maynooth-trained priests will influence how people vote, which will influence how the House of Commons, which will influence the cabinet policy, which will mean, and this is Lord's own words on page 4, that the whole policy of the nation therefore may be moved or influenced by the machinations of the Vatican. The machinations of the Vatican. It would be very easily to be amused at that phrase where we stand in 2026, but it is worth holding into fact that Daniel O'Connell had, in living memory, mobilised mass political movements on a scale that was astonishing to Westminster. The Catholic clergy has played a significant role in that. The fear of organised Catholic political influence was not invented from nothing. It was, in Lord's case, being applied with rather more force than the evidence warranted, but it was not conjured from nowhere. The specific charges against Maynooth's curriculum emerged from the parliamentary debates following the 1853 Royal Commission, which mirror exactly what Lord is summarising in his book. The most discussed was whether Catholic theology held that oaths made to Protestants, heretics in the theological terminology being quoted, were not binding. His question occupied days of debates in Commons in 1855, as recorded in Hansard. What makes it interesting is that the Maynooth professors responded directly. One of the witnesses, identified in Lord's chapter 6 on pages 100 and onwards, described leaving the college with the impression that the church could dispense with oaths whenever the utility of the church required it. Lord presents this as damning. What he does not emphasise is that this was the witness description of an impression, that other professors submitted written statements in the same parliamentary inquiry affirming that an oath made to a Protestant carried exactly the same weight as one made to a Catholic. Then there's the matter of the Pope's authority in cases of conflict between sovereign and her subjects. This is where Lord's book becomes, quite frankly, a little dramatic, because the evidence he quotes from the Commission hearing is, on the face of it, extraordinary. Chapter 6, on page 88, it contains this exchange, and note that Lord chooses to print the key conclusion in capital letters again. He seemed fond of shouting in uppercase. Would his decision in any manner augment the right to rebel, or in any manner relax the duty of obedience? Certainly not. But he can teach men they should obey, and by necessary consequences, when they may rebel. That is the Maynooth-trained witness telling a royal commission in so many words that the Pope has the authority to tell Catholics when the oath of allegiance has ceased to bind. Lord presents this as evidence that the college is a threat to the constitutional order. The broader context of that same witness immediately qualified by saying that the Pope could not create a justification for rebellion where none existed, and that such papal declaration would merely make known what circumstances already determined, is naturally somewhat less prominently featured. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, the Queen was considering the Maynooth debate and blushing at the situation. In April 1845, Queen Victoria was just 25 years of age and writing regularly to her uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, and she was watching the Maynooth discussion unfold with what I can only describe as increasing impatience. On April 15th, 1845, she wrote from Buckingham Palace, and I actually am lucky to have all 3 volumes of her selected letters, which I'm very, very proud of, and she wrote this particular letter in volume 2. My beloved uncle, here we are in a great state of agitation about one of the greatest measures ever proposed. I am sure poor Peel ought to be blessed by all Catholics for the manly and noble way in which he stands forth to protect and do good to the poor in Ireland. But the bigotry, the wicked and blind passions it brings forth is quite dreadful, and I blush for the Protestantism. A Presbyterian clergyman said very truly, bigotry is more common than shame. I blush for the Protestantism, said by a Protestant queen about a Protestant behaviour in a private letter to her Protestant uncle. 8 days later the bill had passed, and its second reading, and Victoria wrote again. My dearest uncle, our Maynooth bill is through the second reading. I think if you read Sir Robert's admirable speeches, you will see how good his plan is. The Catholics are quite delighted at it, full of gratitude, and behave extremely well. But the Protestants behave shockingly and display a narrow-mindedness and want of sense on the subject of religion which is quite a disgrace to the nation. The case of Austria, France, etc., cannot be compared to this, as this is a Protestant country while the others are Catholic, and I think it would never do to support a Roman Catholic church with money belonging to a Protestant church. The Protestant establishment in Ireland must remain untouched, but let the Roman Catholic clergy be well and handsomely educated. Victoria is not calling for Irish independence or Catholic equality as an absolute principle. She's quite firm that the Protestant establishment in Ireland should remain untouched. And we can note from an Irish perspective that the Protestant establishment was itself a significant part of what Professor Murray of Maynooth was objecting to, with some feeling in writings that got him cited in Lord's book as a seditious influence. But her assessment of the Protestant reaction, narrow-mindedness and want of sense on the subject of religion, which is quite a disgrace to the nation, is about as direct as a royal opinion on political controversy as you will find in that collection. And then there's the footnote on page 37, footnote 1. The editors of Victoria's letters include at the bottom of that page a remark by the historian and MP Thomas Babington Macaulay, recording during the parliamentary debate of the previous evening. Macaulay, one of the great prose and stylists of the Victorian age, author of the History of England, and a man who clearly enjoyed having the right phrase to hand, said this. The Orangeman raises his war whoop. Exeter Hall sets up his bray. Mr. McNeill shudders to see the more costly cheer than ever provided for the priests of ball at the table of the Queen. And the Protestant operatives of Dublin call for impeachments in exceedingly bad English. The exceedingly bad English here is, to be clear, not a comment on anyone's language. It is Macaulay's skewering of the quality of the arguments and their petitions. The logic was muddled, the grammar was poor, the rhetoric overwrought, and he was making the point that people calling for impeachments could not, at minimum, get their syntax in order. This is a very Victorian way of saying, your position is incoherent and it shows. As a counterpoint to Victoria's view, and in the spirit of fairness, here's what James Lord offers what he considers the correct Protestant position. They protest against popery as false in its theory and idolatrous in its worship. They see it as practical workings is to make the priesthood tyrants and the people slaves. The universal supremacy is the object. Its spiritual influence is directed to forge chains and fetters for the souls, no less than the bodies of men. It obtrusively intermeddles with the affairs of nations and seeks to reduce monarchies, republics, aristocracies, and servile obedience, or to ruin. There you have it in one paragraph. The theological, the political, and the cosmic. Priesthood as a tyranny. Souls in chains, monarchy reduced to ruin. One can only imagine what Lord would have made of Queen Victoria's letters had he ever read them. The Protestant monarch blushing for Protestantism while he was writing about chains and fetters of the souls of men. The distance between those two positions, both held by Protestants in the same country, is perhaps the most interesting thing about the whole controversy. So we come back to the book, the one sitting in my collection, published in 1855 by the Protestants Association's office, a full decade after the events that Victoria was actually writing about. And in the same year, that parliamentary debate over in the 1853 Royal Commission was running at full volume. James Lord, the author, describes himself on the title pages as of the Inner Temple, Esquire, barrister at law, author of the Maynooth College Grant and the law with reference thereto, etc., etc. This was not his first piece of writing on the subject. The list of his publications at the front of the book, running from 1841, the work on Maynooth Grant, to an appeal on the Protestant electors of Great Britain and the oaths taken by Roman Catholic peers and members of Parliament, gives you a clearer picture of the man who had been focused on this particular problem for 15 years. What Lord was doing with his digest is stated plainly in the introductory remarks. He describes his intentions as acting as a judge presenting the entire case with the evidence on each side, and then produces 296 pages that concern themselves exclusively with the evidence supported to the case against Maynooth. The subtitle specifies this. He is interested in those portions of the Commission evidence relating to the antisocial, immoral, and anti-national tendency of the teaching. The portions relating to the functioning seminary, the well-trained priests, the quiet parishes, those are not his subject. The most dramatic testimony in the book comes from witnesses who had left Maynooth and subsequently converted to Protestantism. Their accounts form the emotional core of his argument, and they are presented at considerable length in Chapter 8. Here is what the Reverend William J. Burke, who entered Maynooth in 1825 and joined the Protestant Church in 1844, Lord quotes him from the Commission evidence. "From the open and undisguised disloyalty practiced at Maynooth, from what I have witnessed in it, the scenes that took place in 1829, at the time of taking the oath of allegiance, I say I left it a rebel of the first water, thirsting and desiring and praying for the destruction of the British Empire, and solely because it was Protestant. Those, I say, were my own feelings and sentiments." The same witness, the following day of his examination on page 190 in Lord's Digest, returned the same theme with even less ambiguity. "I entered Maynooth as a loyal subject and left it the vilest rebel. I took upon Maynooth as the hotbed of sedation." Now, a few things worth noting about this testimony. Reverend Burke left Maynooth in and around the 1830s, gave evidence before the Commission in 1853, and was therefore describing feelings and impression from roughly 20 years earlier. He had by the time given his evidence converted to Protestantism and was presumably not a wholly disinterested witness. Lord does not dwell on any of this. Of course, he was impartial in his own mind. He presents the testimony as directly damning, which in terms of theatrical impact, it is undoubtedly a rebel of the first water, thirsting and desiring and praying for the destruction of the British Empire. That is the sentence that would land well with an anti-Maynooth conference. Whether it constituted evidence that the college was systematically producing seditious priests across the board is somewhat a different question. Before Lord reaches his conclusion, however, he includes something that slightly complicates his own argument. He reproduces a letter from the Bishop John Cantwell of Meath, published in the tablet of the 5th of May 1855, addressed to the clergy of his diocese. Lord includes it as evidence on the Church's political organisation. What it actually reads in 2026 is the description of conditions of Catholic life in Ireland that goes some way towards explaining why the priesthood was political at all. Here is Bishop Cantwell, April 1855. "Reverend and dear Sir, when I lately addressed you and the faithful Catholics of this diocese, I deemed it my duty to advert to the great social and religious grievances which, in common with the Catholics of Ireland, it is our sad lot still to endure. I directed your attention to a special manner to the iniquitous laws which enforce the rights without compelling the duties of landlords. I ventured to condemn as most unjust the oppressive, the politically pursued by successive governments towards Catholics in the army, navy, military schools, and all the public institutions of the kingdom, and also briefly noted the Protestant church establishment as one of the principal sources of all the calamities of the country. Convinced that circumstances rendered the time opportune and favourable, I exhorted to you by country and parochial petitions to urge on the legislator and justice and necessity and full and speedy redress." Lord quotes this letter as evidence of precisely interference in political affairs. Bishop Cantwell was writing in the aftermath of the famine. 1 million dead, another million emigrated, tenant farmers still without legal protections from evictions. All the calamities of the country. It was a description of a specific, recent and ongoing situation. Lord includes in Chapter 8 a detail from the Oath of Allegiance testimony that has a quality all of its own. A witness is describing how the Oath of Allegiance was administered to Maynooth students. The students filed into an open court. A man read from the parchment below. The students repeated the words in large groups. The gallery was cleared for us, and the oath was administered by a person reading from a parchment below. He would read 2 or 3 words to the students, who, in one voice, repeated the same. Then he repeated 1 or 2 more words, and those students again repeated, all speaking at the same time, so that nothing could be heard but a confused hum of voices. And then a few questions later, I heard a student who had his hand on the same book swear the very opposite of the Oath of Allegiance. Nothing more was apparently done about this, and the student whose hand was on the same book as another student swearing the opposite oath in a confused hum of voices received no recorded reprimand. Lord presents it as evidence of institutional disrespect for the oath of allegiance. It also reads from a distance of a fairly vivid account of how legal formality was being treated by all parties. The conclusion that Lord draws from all of this in his final chapter has a quality of cosmic certainty that I think is a real signature of the book. There is a wheel within a wheel. Everything ecclesiastical, political, national, domestic is made to revolve around one centre, and that centre is Rome. Everything ecclesiastical, political, national, and domestic revolving around Rome. He means it literally. He is describing a world in which the financing of a seminary in County Kildare is a thread in a global web of papal strategy. And he ends the book at chapter 10 with a statement that is at once a warning, a prediction, and a call to arms. Sooner or later, we must expect either Protestant ascendancy or Romish ascendancy. There it is, the whole argument distilled. Not a question of whether Maynooth is teaching students well, or whether the building needs repair, or whether the curriculum has been improved since 1845. A question of which ascendancy wins. From that perspective, funding of the seminary, at all its simplicity, choosing your own defeat. It is a perfectly logical position once you accept the premise that it is a zero-sum conflict, which Lord absolutely does. I want to place beside this one another voice, not an Irish Catholic voice. That would be a little too easy and a little expected. Instead, I'm going to introduce Mr. William Cobbett, whose book I also happen to own, and hopefully I will revisit in another episode. Cobbett, who also wrote Advice to Young Men, which I mentioned in a totally different episode, was born in Farnham, Surrey in 1763. He was a farmer's son who became one of the most widely read journalists of his age. He was, throughout his life, a member of the Church of England. He had no Catholic background whatsoever. He was, in other words, the sort of Englishman who might have been expected to write something rather like Lord's Digest. Cobbett's History of the Protestant Reformation, published in instalments from 1824, stunned the Protestant world of 19th century England. The fact that it was so sympathetic to the Catholic cause and written by a fellow Church of England Protestant made it an overnight bestseller. His argument was not theological, it was historical and economic. He looked at what the Reformation had actually done, the dissolution of monasteries, the destruction of the social welfare structures the Church had maintained, the penal laws imposed on Irish Catholics, the poverty of the rural poor in his own lifetime. And he traced a line from those events to the misery that he saw around him. According to his biographer Daniel Green, in Great Cobbett, the Noblest Agitator, Cobbett was defined throughout his life by a ferocious instinct for following an argument wherever the evidence led, regardless of whose feelings it damaged. He wrote about the Reformation in language that still has considerable force. The Reformation, it is called, was engendered in beastly lust, brought forth hypocrisy and ascendancy, cherished and fed by plunder, devastation, and by rivers of innocent English and Irish blood. He was not writing as a Catholic convert or an Irish nationalist. He was writing as an English Protestant who had looked at the same historical record that Lord was consulting and arrived at an entirely different conclusion about who owed what to whom. His chapter on Ireland documents the penal laws in detail, the prohibitions on Catholic land ownership, the Catholic education, and the practice of the faith itself, and asks calmly and without grandeur how a population subjected to all of what was supposed to feel about the government that had imposed it. The two books sit on the same shelf. They describe the same historical record and arrive at entirely different conclusions about who owes what to whom. What connects them, and what I find interesting, is that both men were working in good faith from evidence they had considered undeniable, and both believed the situation in Ireland to be the direct product of identifiable causes that had been building for centuries. The difference is that one looked at Maynooth and saw threat, and the other looked at preceding 300 years and saw context. Lord's book does not engage with that context. Cobbett barely mentions Maynooth. Between them, they map the boundaries of an argument that was never, in the end, about a seminary. Between those two positions, and between Mr. Lord's curses and divine judgments and Queen Victoria's blushing for Protestantism, lies the actual history of Maynooth. a seminary in County Kildare built by the British government in 1795 to produce loyal priests, which spent 60 years producing Irish priests. A royal commission that generated 2 folio volumes and more than 6,000 questions and answers, a digest that extracted from those volumes the portions most useful to a predetermined conclusion and published it in the form of an office named after that conclusion. And a queen writing to her uncle in April 1845, noting that the Catholics were behaving extremely well, full of gratitude, while the Protestants were being a disgrace to the nation. Looking back across all of this, so much of the heat of 1845 was being generated by something that was not really about Maynooth at all. The actual seminary, the students, the chapel, the lecture rooms, the building repairs that Peel's capital grant was meant to pay for, barely features in Lord's book at all. He is not especially interested in the college. He is interested in the constitutional and theological argument that the college represents. In that sense, the digest is less a book about institution in County Kildare, and it is more a book about fear. The fear that Catholic Ireland, trained and organised and politically aware, would eventually use the machinery of the British state against itself. Whether that fear was reasonable, whether it was honest, whether it was even coherent, those are questions Lord never quite pauses to ask. Kildare, turns out, was fine. The argument was always somewhere else. Until next time, may your divine judgments be proportionate to the offence. May your impartiality be slightly more impartial than the title page suggests. And may whatever curse is coming for the nation kindly hold off until you finish the roof. This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening. Creating this podcast is a genuine joy for me, and knowing that you're out there listening and engaging with these stories makes it all worthwhile. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Vices and Volumes on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen, and consider leaving a rating or review. It truly helps the show. You can also follow along on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok at Vices and Volumes, or visit vicesandvolumes.com for more information. And please reach out and let me know what you think. I love hearing from you. Thank you for being a part of this journey.